Hello, I'm Connie Kasari. I am a professor here at UCLA and also an investigator in the Center for Autism Research and Treatment. And today I want to talk to you about the next generation of autism intervention science. So briefly, we'll talk about what we know and what we know that we don't know. We'll address research methods and then intervention personalization on meaningful outcomes. So what we know, well, a lot of progress has been made. In the 1980s, about 70% of young children would enter school, like kindergarten age, without being able to use fluent speech. But today, that percentage is only about 30%. So that's a lot of progress. And that is likely due to the proliferation of early intervention programs and greater access to these services. We also have many more rigorously tested interventions using randomized controlled trials. So this is the gold standard of intervention research science. These interventions often have a manual that go along with them, and they address a lot of different kinds of interventions. We also have more individuals who are accessing an inclusive school environment or an integrated community setting. And more individuals are experiencing optimal outcomes. So this is all very good news. But we also know that we have a problem with reproducibility. Now, this is a problem in science generally. Original studies are often small pilots or small samples, and they're usually significant at like the 0.05 level, which is just barely significant. And then when there's a new sample or a replication of the study, it often doesn't replicate. So we have some examples from the early intervention field, but these are not unusual, and they're not only in terms of early intervention. So the original randomized controlled trial of discrete trial training, which is the most common approach to applied behavior analysis for children with autism, was based on a small sample. It was carried out for 30 hours versus 10 hours of this intervention over 2 years. And it was significant, and it was very exciting because there was like a 15-point IQ difference, which was the primary outcome, between the 30-hour-a-week individuals and the 10-hour-a-week. So that was exciting. But in a replication of this study, which was actually a smaller sample, was not significant. In a similar vein, the Early Start Denver model, which is a form of applied behavior analysis, but using much more developmental and naturalistic strategies, it was also significant with about 48 participants, and these children received about 20 hours of ESDM compared to just whatever they could get in the community. And it was exciting. There was, again, a large difference in the percentage or the number of IQ points. But the replication, which was larger, was not significant. And now in a more recent replication, again, it was not significant. So what do we make of these findings, and why is this happening? So there's a counterfactual. This is a problem for researchers in that community interventions improve over time. And sometimes our interventions don't change that we're trying to test. It's really good for the community in that experimental interventions that were effective at one point in time are not effective later on because the community has in some ways caught up with those experimental interventions. This is great for community, but again, a very big challenge for researchers. We also know that we don't know enough about for whom an intervention works. We know that a single intervention doesn't work for all individuals, but who does it work for? And then why does the intervention provide benefit? So we want to understand what the active ingredients or like the important components of an intervention are, because we want to understand why that intervention provides benefit to a particular participant. To answer these questions, we may have better luck if we use a modular interventions. And this can really push the field further along. So I'm going to give you an example from an intervention that we developed at UCLA called the Joint Attention Symbolic Play Engagement and Regulation Early Intervention, called Jasper. So Jasper is a module. It's really a comprehensive social communication module, but it can float inside other interventions. In other words, Jasper isn't done 20 hours a week. It's done, 30 minutes, 15 minutes, an hour at a time. It could be every day. It could be twice a week. But it's just a module that floats inside whatever is in the background. It could be another intervention like an ABA school program or an ABA home-based program. It could be used on its own, especially with young children and mediated through parents. It could be used sequentially. So do we start with a very structured ABA program like discrete trial training, or use a more naturalistic ABA program like Jasper first, and then later add in or change to one of the other interventions? Or we could just combine the interventions right from the beginning. So Jasper, in particular, will apply layers of strategies to try to engineer learning opportunities. And it targets these very specific skills of joint engagement, play skills, joint attention, and language. So it doesn't do everything. It doesn't address motor skills specifically. It doesn't address adaptive behaviors like toilet training or feeding. What we know from a lot of different randomized controlled trials carried out in the setting we want change. So for example, within an ABA-based school program, that we get changes in children who receive Jasper versus children who just receive the background intervention. And here the outcome is on the ability of the child to initiate engagement, joint engagement with others. And you can see the top line are the Jasper children, the dotted line are children that are just getting the background program. Similarly, when we teach parents to do Jasper, we get a similar finding where children receiving Jasper increase in that child-initiated joint engagement, and children receiving a different intervention are not changing in that outcome. So there's a lot of different randomized controlled trials that have been replicated that you can read if you're interested. They're mediated through teachers or therapists or parents. And what we know from these the application of a modular intervention is that you get certain replications on certain outcomes, but it won't be the same across all subgroups and in all contexts. But we begin to learn a little bit about when it works, but we need to understand still better why it works. So when we ask the question of whom does an intervention work, reviews have noted that there are very few variables that rise to the top. And in part, that's because the kinds of assessments that are used to either predict outcome or to moderate that outcome are sort of general domain kinds of assessments, things like an IQ test or an adaptive behavior evaluation. And they don't usually show huge differences for different types of children. There's also, in general, just the sense that if you start with more skills, so you have higher language skills or higher cognitive skills, you're going to progress faster in any of these interventions. But we have very little information on those children who are responding slowly in development or slowly to an intervention. So in a recent study published by my postdoc, Jonathan Panganaban, he looked at the response, children's response to the Jasper intervention if they were already showing limited language skills. So these are approximately 4-year-old children who have very few words. So in this case, fewer than 30 single words. They're receiving module 1 of the ADOS, which means they have either no to limited language. So it's about 100 children. And interesting, he defined children as super responders if they made more language progress on a standardized test, more progress than their age would indicate. So if they had 6 months of intervention, they made more than 6 months language gain in that period of time. And what he found was that play diversity, so children coming in with more ability to be flexible in their play, to play with more toys, actually were more likely to be super responders to Jasper. And that makes sense. Jasper is a play-based intervention. So having some play flexibility, play skills probably means that you're going to progress a little faster. But children who have fewer skills in play diversity and have more delayed fine motor skills actually were slower to respond. So this begins to give us information about who's going to progress very quickly in Jasper and who might not. Using Jasper, again, we have some understanding of the mechanism for Jasper. So this means that we're starting to drill down and think about why Jasper might improve some of these targets. So here we have Jasper as our sort of predictor, and we're trying to predict to one of the outcomes that we work very hard on in Jasper, which is the child's ability to initiate joint attention. So this might be a point to share something or showing something to the parent, or using commenting language. All of those are examples of joint attention. And then we also know that joint attention is a very important target of early intervention, because if you have more initiating joint attention, you are likely to progress faster in language outcomes. So our distal outcome, sort of down the line outcome, is improvement in language on a standardized test. So what we find in this study, this was done actually by our statistician, Wendy Shee, is that the mediator, the reason why we can improve initiating joint attention is through the mechanism of improving joint engagement. So I had just talked about how Jasper improves the ability for children to stay engaged with another person and to also initiate that joint engagement. And that turns out to be a really important target as well, because that is probably the glue that predicts how we can improve joint attention. Clearly, if you can stay engaged longer with another person, you have many more opportunities to learn to engage in social communication. So modular interventions are also interesting because you can use them to build a comprehensive intervention. So it's clear that a lot of our children need pretty intensive interventions, especially early on. But you can take a module like Jasper, or something like a module on executive function skills, or another module on adaptive behavior, and you can use those in combination to build that comprehensive model. It's kind of what school teachers do. They will take different curricula, which could be considered a module. You're doing a literacy module, and you then put that together with other kinds of activities during the day, which could be other evidence-based modules. We have examples from the field in that cognitive behavioral therapies are really a module. They're added in to whatever else the child might be receiving. And we have evidence that they can affect reductions in anxiety for children with autism. We also know that we have executive function interventions that are evidence-based, and they can improve the child's ability to be flexible in their behaviors and to be more planful in their actions. And then academic interventions are actually increasing with some evidence-based, especially around foundational reading skills. So I think it's an exciting time in terms of interventions in general for autism. So I want to pay a little bit of attention to methods because methods matter. There are a lot of interventions that have been developed over the past decade or two. And many of these are manualized and they're marketed, but not that many interventions have actually been tested using rigorous methods like the randomized controlled trial. We also need to recognize that most autistic children have never been in a research study. So when you think about the evidence base for autism interventions, it doesn't represent the entire spectrum of autism. So who's left out? Well, we know that traditionally marginalized and minoritized populations are often not included. We know that children with very few skills or intellectual disabilities are often excluded from these studies. So we do have methods that we can use to recruit more diverse samples that really reflect the entire population of autism. And so I'm going to talk about those next. But another issue is that we need to shorten the gap between research and practice, and to be able to sustain research interventions that actually work in the community. We know that there's this 17-year gap between finding something that works in research and actually getting that implemented in the community. So clearly, that's way too long to wait. So one approach to trying to diversify study populations is using something called community partnered participatory research methods, or CPPR. And these were really developed and advocated by a community partner of ours called Healthy African American Families. It was led by Loretta Jones, who for many years worked with UCLA researchers on advancing these methods. She passed a few years ago, sadly, but her daughter, Felica Jones, is continuing this line of work. So CPPR emphasizes this academic community partnership. And they stress that academic members should become part of the community, and the community members should be part of the research team. And so when they work together, they do all aspects of a study together. They design the study, they collect the data together, they analyze the data, and they interpret the data to be published. And they actually publish together as well. This method is very strength-based, really celebrating the community's capacities. And there has to be a balance of academic goals and community goals for what Loretta used to call the win-win. So we've been using these methods for the past 8 to 10 years in our Autism Intervention Research Network on Behavioral Health. This is a network of researchers who collaborate with communities in their local context to improve the lives of individuals with autism throughout their lifespan. And we emphasize the inclusion of those traditionally marginalized and minoritized because we're trying to increase equity in autism interventions and services. So our research sites, you can see on the left, so it's 7 sites across the country. And on the right are the community partners that we at UCLA have engaged. So it's a range from our local school districts to community partners. And the glue that holds us together are these methods of CPPR. Currently, we're doing an intervention that was developed by our Kansas research partners called the Self-Determined Learning Model of Instruction. And this is a 22 lesson plan intervention that is addressing self-determination of adolescents and young adults with neurodevelopmental disabilities. In fact, it hadn't been applied to autism until recently, and that is what we're doing. So self-determination is the ability to have the individual be in the driver's seat of their own life. So in other words, they can set a goal for themselves, they can plan the process, the actions for how they're going to achieve that goal. And then at the end, they're going to reflect on how that went, and they're going to adjust the goal or plan. And then they're going to repeat that process. So it's a very targeted, modular intervention. We are training teachers and community folks who work with adolescents and adults on the autism spectrum. And we're teaching them remotely and then coaching them through this process. But we do this in collaboration with our community partners. So this intervention is a relatively new intervention for us, but it has many randomized controlled trials showing that it's very effective in increasing self-determination. There are a couple of other interventions that we have done over the years that we have shown through randomized controlled trials actually work. And they have been done in community. So one of those is Remaking Recess, where we train paraprofessionals or whoever's on the recess yard at school. We teach them strategies on how to engage children to be included in games or interactions with each other, so that it increases peer interactions and actually friendships. The other study we have tested is called Mind the Gap. And this is working with community partners to actually help families to decrease the amount of time it takes to get a diagnosis of autism and to actually get engaged in intervention services. So it's shortening that gap between diagnosis and interventions. So we have tested these interventions now multiple times over a number of years, but we have a problem in that once we leave as researchers, these interventions often are not sustained in community. In part, that's because there's a lot of turnover in folks who are working in the community and have knowledge of the intervention. And there are probably a million other reasons, but it's a problem. So in our latest AIR-B focus, we developed an implementation strategy intervention. So using implementation science methods, where we are using social networks and teaming approaches to help the site. So whether this is a school district or a community agency, to actually implement these interventions and sustain them over time. And then we're evaluating our process of implementation and sustainment. This intervention is called United, and it's very unique in the intervention world. We have very few implementation strategy interventions where we're really trying to empower the community to take on the intervention and maintain it over time. And so currently we're doing all three of these interventions. This will happen over the next few years using United. In this case, the randomization happens at United. So all of our participants get the intervention, say Remaking Recess, and only half of the participants will get randomized to United, where we coach them through this implementation strategy intervention. So that is what we're testing. Okay, other studies have a different approach to implementation science. So rather than using an approach that's really focused on the sustainment of the intervention, they're trying to get the intervention just in the community right from the start. And we've been doing this for, I don't know, a number of years now. And that is taking studies out of the lab and putting them in community right from the beginning. So trying to just cut out that 17-year gap to get interventions in the community. So we've done that with Jasper. We've brought it into early childhood settings, like toddler programs that see, like childcare centers that see children with autism, or schools, preschools. And this work has really been spearheaded by my graduate or former graduate students now, Stephanie Shire, Yachi Cheng, and Jonathan Panganaban. We've also taken Remaking Recess into school settings here in the United States, but in other places in the world. And this work has been spearheaded by former graduate students, Michelle Dean, Mark Kretzmann, and Jill Locke. So finally, that brings us to kind of this new approach to intervention science, which is really thinking about personalized medicine. How do we personalize an intervention with a meaningful outcome for individuals with autism? So we have been doing adaptive intervention designs, and it's a way to really systematize clinical practice. So if you can imagine that there is an clinician out there that everybody wants to see because they're known to be magical with children. So he or she probably has a lot of tools in their toolbox and probably uses really good clinical judgment. But that one person doesn't have the bandwidth to see the numbers of children that he or she needs to see. And they also don't have an understanding of exactly what they're doing in order to train a whole new cohort of therapists. So adaptive intervention designs are really a way to systematize clinical practice. So the definition is that it uses a sequence of decision rules that specify whether, how, and when, and based on what measures, you're going to alter something about the intervention. So type, delivery, or decision, or type of intervention. And you're going to do that at very specific points in the course of care. And those decisions are made really based on the response of the individual in the intervention. So this is often a good approach to use with individuals who have often been excluded from intervention studies. They're excluded because oftentimes researchers think that they might not benefit from that particular intervention. And the minimally verbal are a good example of that. We didn't have, until recently, very many interventions specifically designed for minimally verbal interventions. In 2010, I co-led an NIH workshop with Helen Tager-Flesberg. And the goal of that workshop was to try to figure out at the time who were the individuals who were nonverbal. What were their characteristics? And what we learned is that most individuals are not nonverbal, but they're minimally verbal. And that's defined by the number of functional words they can speak. They're usually not putting words together in phrases, but they just have single words. We often define this as fewer than 20 by the time you enter kindergarten. What we learned is that some children can actually speak, but they rarely do, or they only do it in some contexts. So it's the child who speaks at home, but doesn't speak at school. Or it's the child who uses scripted language, a phrase that they've learned from, say, TV. They use that phrase to communicate, but it may not be connected to the context in which they're trying to communicate about. And so what do we do in interventions? Well, the treatment is often to just do more of the same. So to give more hours of the same treatment, or to do less, which is even worse. And that's to blame the child for not making progress. So I'm going to give you an example of an adaptive intervention design that we completed. It's a very simple one as far as these go. And we were trying to address a current controversy for teaching speech. So at the time, and even still today, there are parents and some therapists who believe that if you start with an augmentative device, these are speech generating devices or augmentative alternative communication devices, that's going to delay or prevent spoken language. So this is like giving an iPad that has pictures on the iPad. And when you press the picture, it says the word. So it generates the speech. And there are people that still believe that that is going to delay or prevent the child from actually using their voice to speak. So we did an intervention with 61 children. They were minimally verbal, fewer than 20 functional words, and they were between 5 years and 8 years because that was believed at the time to be that window most likely when children would be able to learn spoken language. All of the children had been involved in intensive early interventions. And most of those interventions were kind of traditional ABA-based models. So we didn't want to give them more of the same. We instead gave them Jasper, which we assumed that they probably had not had, and we blended Jasper with a spoken language intervention called enhanced milieu teaching. And I'll describe what that is. So it's a blended intervention, and all of the children got the intervention twice a week, 1-hour sessions twice a week for 3 months. And then we changed something after the first phase of development if they were responding slowly. But half of the children also received a speech generating device. Okay, so the sample was primarily male, as we would expect. About half were ethnic minority backgrounds, and the average age was 6. The nonverbal cognitive scores, so based on a LIDER, which doesn't expect children to talk to get some indication of what they're understanding, was actually quite broad. So a range from 38 to 140. So it shows you that this subgroup of children is also incredibly heterogeneous. So Jasper, as we've talked about, prioritizes engagement and social communication to teach language. Enhanced milieu teaching actually structures language prompting procedures. So it's very specific about using time delays and then a prompting procedure that's based at the child's communication level. So we did something called an adaptive treatment model that's called a SMART, which is a sequential multiple assignment randomized trial, which just means that there's more than one randomization. So in the beginning, all of the children got the blended intervention, shortened here on the graph as JASP, and half were randomized to receive the speech generating device. And this is an iPad with Proloquo2Go software. This first stage of treatment was 12 weeks, and then we measured their response. And we wanted to see a 25% gain in socially communicative utterances, socially related utterances. So 25% gain over their baseline. And then they would be deemed a responder, and they would just stay the course on whatever intervention the one that they received in the beginning. If they were a slow responder and they got the augmentative device, they had the opportunity to now be randomized to either get an extra session a week or just an extra session a week. If they didn't get the augmentative device, they had the opportunity of getting the device or the extra session a week. So in other words, we didn't take away the device if they started with the device. Their only option was to get more sessions. Okay, so the primary outcome measure was a natural language sample, which is viewed as a more meaningful outcome for these children since they don't do very well on standardized tests. So it's a 20-minute interaction between an adult and a child. And then we took the language sample and we transcribed it using something called SALT, where the coder then codes each utterance for generativity, meaning not scripted, and function. So whether it was a comment or requesting word or a protest or something else. And we coded both spoken and speech generated utterances. So that total outcome, the primary outcome we're interested in is something spoken that is a communicative utterance that is socially related. So what do we find? So the black line are the children who got the augmentative device right from the beginning, and the red line are those without the device. And you can see that spoken language improved for children getting the device in that first phase very quickly. So some children were saying more than 60 words, new words. In the second phase, we continued, or we changed something about the intervention. We also brought parents in for parent training, and you can see that it continues to increase. At 24 weeks, we were finished with the study and children went into a follow-up phase. So you can see that spoken language on the next assessment dips down a little bit, but it's still greater than baseline. The children who didn't get the device right from the beginning and just the behavioral intervention actually are making slow and steady progress. It's just slow. We also found similar findings for the number of new novel words that children were producing if they got the device right from the beginning. And also they were saying more comments. So most interventions really focus on requesting language. We prioritize commenting language or joint attention language. And so that also increased for children who got the device right from the beginning. Okay, so the importance of the speech generating device added into a behavioral intervention right from the beginning is very clear in these data. Only about 10% of the coded words were generated on the speech generating device. So children were primarily using spoken language. I think in this case, we can't overlook the importance of the behavioral intervention. So in other words, you can't just give a child an iPad with Proloquo or some other software on it and expect that they're going to be able to use it. The child needs support to learn, and they need a context for communication. So in this intervention, the adult modeled on the speech generating device in the context of play interactions that really prioritize communication. So that's a really important point here. And I'm going to show what I'm talking about in data that Charlotte DiStefano, a former graduate student of mine, did with these same data. So she looked at the children's ability to initiate an interchange, a back and forth sort of conversation or interchange with the adult. And she was interested in whether it was child initiated or whether it was adult initiated. And what's interesting here is right at entry, so the black part of the bar graph is adult initiated exchanges, and the gray part are child initiated exchanges. And even at entry, there are more child initiated exchanges with an adult, with the therapist, than the adult made. So that's interesting. But you can see that over the course of intervention, here's at 3 months midpoint and at exit 6 months, you can see that the child-initiated exchanges are growing and the adult-initiated exchanges are staying fairly flat. So again, the context and the behavioral intervention matters here. Okay, so this was an example of how to personalize an intervention based on a child's response to intervention. But we have many more examples in the field, both at UCLA, but broadly across the autism field. And these interventions in the future are likely going to increase both novel and targeted therapeutics. We've had a number of advancements in neuroscience, and that's likely going to lead to the combination of biological and behavioral measures and interventions. So there are some active projects. I know the ones at UCLA. So we're using neuroscience methods, for example, EEG or neuroimaging, to determine a predictor of response to intervention. So is there something different about brain behavior that's actually going to predict how well a child or individual will respond to an intervention? We're also beginning to look at how brain and behavior changes go hand in hand over time. Either they are together or perhaps they're not over the course of intervention. There's some work on the use of targeted therapeutics like a psychopharmacology agent with a behavioral intervention to test whether there are added benefits. And then these adaptive trials, these smart designs are going on right now that are addressing issues of dose, like how much do we need to do the intervention? How long do we wait before we can determine a response to intervention? What happens if we begin with one intervention and then add in another? So thinking about these interventions done sequentially, kind of like how we think about diets, whether we do a combination of exercise and, diet or food intake at the beginning, or whether we do those sequentially. For different individuals, that's going to work in different ways. So those are all in progress. And so we'll look for those results in the coming years. We also have extensions of our populations. So most of the work has been done on early interventions, but we're starting to see more work in the area of school-age children, adolescents, and adults. Very few interventions that are effective for adults, but we know that we're adults far longer than we're children. So this is a very important area of the future research. There's also some interest in infants who have older siblings with autism. About 20% of infants with an older sibling will go on and be diagnosed with autism, but about 40% of children of these infants will have delays, particularly in language. Can we provide intervention early to try to lessen the impact of those delays? And then there's a focus on women because, as you know, there are many more boys that are diagnosed with autism than girls, and females may have particular interventions that will work differently for them than for males. So in summary, current intervention research studies show a lot of promise. We're including more diverse populations of autistic individuals, and really trying to diversify and increase the evidence base across the full spectrum of autism. We are conducting studies in real-world settings, in homes, in schools, and community settings. And so I think that's good news. And then studies are just beginning to test for whom an intervention works and why they work. But this is very important work that we need to conduct, because if we know what the mechanism of an intervention is, then that's the part that needs to be replicated, and maybe some other things aren't so important. This research that we're doing across the field on active ingredients of interventions will likely be multi-component. So it will be complicated work, but very important. And then more studies on adaptive intervention designs that can actually personalize an intervention for individuals will be very important work in the future. So I want to thank you for your time today and express appreciation to my funding agencies for the work that's been done, for all of the individuals in my lab at UCLA who have contributed, as well as my community partners, and of course, the families and children that have given up their time and energy to the kinds of work that we're doing here at UCLA. So thank you very much.